And we sat there, and what I heard was not encouraging. So it could be another Che. It was the same week, just parenthetically before I begin, it was the same week that I saw a film that was screened in the house of Bill Klein, who is a cineast and who makes the Next Patriot, not the Next Patriot, lives in Paris, known for a long time. And he just made a film about Cleaver, which I think is showing somewhere in the United States, or will at any rate. And he had a screening of a film that the newsreel kids had brought in, which they hadn't at that point decided whether to show or not, and they wanted some critical attention. Well, there were only 4 of us watching this screening. It was a full-length film called Ice, which since has been released, I think, unfortunately. And what it did was to project the modalities of a revolution in the United States. There was one in the film, and it was shown. And it was, in my judgment, I must say, incredible, really incredible. And there was a long discussion that ensued with newsreel kids, as you can imagine. I had not extravagant judgments. I simply thought that the film would set the movement back 1,000 years. And went on to explain why. For example, everybody in the film making this revolution, well, they were all very identifiable. They could have been here in Madison or in the Rathskeller or in Columbia in the Lion's Den or anywhere. And you didn't see any of the other folk out there. And every once in a while, somebody came rushing into a room and said, the doctors are with us. You never saw the workers, or any of those people. And then, in terms of intersexual relationships, it struck me for a New Left enterprise a bit strange. You saw these girls running all over town, stuffing messages in mailboxes and so forth. And then every once in a while there'd be a high-level discussion, and they sat in the corner. And I thought that was very bad, and thought that really was setting things back a bit. And thought, well, maybe they'll raise that question in the film. And suddenly one of the girls in the film comes forth, and she says to one of the big wheels who is doing planning, and she says to him, you know, I mean, I'm just tired as hell. I'm shagging all over town, stuffing mailboxes, and I just don't want to do that. I mean, I want to, this is my revolution too, and so forth. And whereupon he really treats that question with the height of the traditional bourgeois rationality. He whacks her across the room.
What? Yes.
And she says, then she gets up and says, I guess I have that coming to me. What comes out of those particular things, frankly, the one thing that bothers me at the end of the first day of the so-called spring offensive in the film, which is where a few objectives are blown up that are supposed to be blown up that day, and the city is paralyzed. And the next scene is in the basement somewhere, and all of the militants are together at a long table with, you know, the Chianti bottles and the candles, and lots of spaghetti, and bongo drums, and then lots of very serious smoke. And I said, now, wait a minute, just stop the film for a minute. This is the end of the first day of the revolution, and you're all playing bongos in the cellar. Where is the constabulary? And where is the state? And the answer I got was, well, you have a very old-fashioned view. And that's not our kind of revolution. Insights into Lenin were a movie. Like a show. Along with Rosa Luxemburg and Shep. We still hear the echoes of the controversy between Herman Carter and Lenin. Because when Carter, in his answer to Lenin, opened a debate, he opened a debate which really echoes down to the present time. And when he posed certain questions, he really was posing questions that still remain, because in a certain sense there are no answers, no clear and precise answers to those particular questions. What it all boils down to is the problem of quantity and quality. Because Lenin, like Trotsky, like Rosa Luxemburg, like many practiced revolutionaries, is in effect saying that you cannot make a revolution unless the masses are with the party that professes to make that revolution. That any party, whether it is itself large or small, must have a mass support. And consequently, there is a prematuration. There is a premature quality to any situation in which a party tries to make a revolution with a tiny minority and without a basic, real sense of mass support. Whereas Carter is saying something else. He is saying that if you try to build that mass support by opening your party to all kinds of people who are not authentic revolutionaries, by going to the people, if you please, in the trade unions, or by going to the people in elections, pretty soon the means that you are using to corral those people and to entice them, the means of elections or trade unions, will become ends in themselves. Better to have a very small party, qualitatively pure, one that really is composed of revolutionaries, that does confront the society in direct action, and that by its example, and by waiting until the economic conditions break down, really is there and can catalyze a revolution at the proper moment. It is the problem, really, of the quality and the quantity of the argument. Lenin saying that you cannot exploit this situation in 1920 without large parties. Carter saying that if you have large parties on the basis that you are setting down, you will only have a degeneration into what social democracy became. And so Carter, at the high point of his brochure, says this to Lenin: instead of making the Third International internally strong, we are now turning again to opportunism, just as social democracy once did. Now everything must be included. The trade union, German independent socialists, the French centrists, parts of the British Labour Party. In order to preserve Marxist appearances, conditions are set down which must be signed, and Kautsky, Hilferding, Thoma, etc. are excluded. The masses, the middle-class masses, are, however, included and pulled in by every means. But the best revolutionaries, such as the KAPD, are excluded. Of what use are the impressive principles, the brilliant theses of the Third International, if we are actually practicing opportunism? The Second International also had the most beautiful principles, but it failed because of its deeds. To which Lenin had an answer. Lenin had an answer in terms of the logic of his position in 1920. The logic of that position rested upon several premises. It rested, first of all, upon the premise that in 1920, at the high point of the post-war disorganization, there really was a revolutionary situation gathering in Europe. That is to say that there was a conjuncture between economic breakdown, unemployment, high prices, and the like, political instability, the instability of the governments that had been installed, and a growing radicalization of the mass. All of that made for a revolutionary situation. But the second premise is equally important, and that is that one does not know when that revolution will happen or where it will begin. In other words, that the bourgeoisie, that the existing state, has tremendous staying power, that it has police after all, it has army, it has economic retribution, and consequently it is not an easy pushover. And third, that you must therefore avoid putschism. You must not be so hung up with the idea that a revolutionary situation is there, that you think that without proper preparation, without the proper infrastructure of support, it is possible to exploit that. That what is needed fundamentally are reasonably large parties, or parties that command that infrastructure of support. Now, says Lenin, those parties cannot, under any circumstances, include outright traitors to the working class. They cannot include those reformists, those people so integrated into the society that they would always frustrate a kind of revolutionary move.
But you must make that schism, says Lenin, in the existing parties as far into the center as possible. What he is saying is that if we go to where the masses are, the working class people, into the trade unions, into elections, we can draw a great number of people into our party and in the very process of revolutionary action really steal their will and make of them bona fide communists, even if they may be social democrats at the present and contemporary moment. And consequently, Lenin's position was that it was a risk, but a necessary risk to exploit the circumstances of 1920. Now, in terms of coping with that risk, Lenin posed two possible alternatives to failure. One alternative to failure was to set very stringent conditions upon the entry of communist parties into the Third International, and hence very stringent conditions on the entry of militants into communist parties. What Lenin is talking about when he is talking about these 21 conditions which he himself had written up and which he himself had insisted upon, what he is saying is that the Third International will not be like the Second. It will impose discipline on all of its member parties, and that communist parties will not be like socialist parties, that they will impose discipline upon each of their militants. Now, these 21 conditions are, on paper, draconian conditions. In other words, they are very harsh conditions. They demand a tremendous amount of a militant who becomes a communist and of a party which comes to be part of the Third International. They demand, in the very first of those conditions, that the press, the organ of propaganda, always be in the hands of pure communists, people who really are fighting the revolution through their propaganda. In the very second of those conditions, every organization which wishes to join the Communist International must, in a planned fashion, remove reformists and centrists from every responsible position in the workers' movement. Party organizations, editorial boards, trade unions, parliamentary fractions, out with the reformists. Those people will hold no positions within these communist parties. And then that third article, which is so important in terms of differentiating communism from socialism. It is the condition about illegalism, about the necessity of a clandestine and illegal apparatus, the apparat as it was called, even if you engage in legal activity also. In practically every country of Europe and America, the class struggle is entering the phase of civil war. In these circumstances, communists can have no confidence in bourgeois legality. They are obliged everywhere to create a parallel illegal organization which at a decisive moment will help the party to do its duty to the revolution. And those articles of the 21 conditions become even more stringent when one demands, for example, anti-military propaganda inside the army, when one demands that communists go into trade unions and organize cells there, or noyaux, in order to convert those unions to revolutionary goals. When one demands, if you please, not social pacifism, but outright anti-patriotism on the part of the party. And then listen to these two last articles, 20 and 21, which are so very important. Those parties which now wish to join the Communist International, but which have not radically changed their former tactics, and you see how worried Lenin is about the risk that is being taken here, but have not radically changed their former tactics, must see to it that before entering the Communist International, not less than 2/3 of the members of their Central Committee and of all their leading central bodies consist of comrades who publicly and unambiguously advocated the entry of their party into the Communist International before the Second World Congress. In other words, no recent arrivals, no arrivés, that the people, 2/3 of them, who should be in the Central Committee and all other boards, would be communists of the first hour. In other words, really tried and tested revolutionaries. And then Article 21, the schism article, those members of the party who reject in principle the conditions and theses put forward by the Communist International are to be expelled from the party. In other words, what these 21 conditions were going to do, in Lenin's view, is precisely what they did do to create schism in the large socialist parties of Europe, the idea being that the communists would win a good part of those parties and consequently be large, but lock off the people whom it was impossible to deal with. Now, did it work that way? Was that the reality? Was Lenin's risk worth taking? The reality was that in the three largest socialist parties, there was a schism, and the communists did pick up a considerable strength. It happened in terms of the schism in October of 1920 at the Congress of Halle in Germany of the USPD, of the Independent Socialist Party. That Independent Socialist Party had gone to Moscow, had looked at these conditions, and then held a Congress in October of 1920, and there was a split. The old vaunted leaders like Hilferding and Diekmann, they couldn't go along with it. And a party that had 900,000 members split so that 300,000 joined the KPD in December and became communists. The others continued on as independent socialists. But you see, you got a mass German Communist Party by December of 1920, a party of some 400,000 members. The same thing happened in France in even more favorable circumstances, because in France, in December of 1920, on Christmas Day of that December, was held the famous Congress of Tours. And the Congress of Tours was the founding Congress of the French Communist Party, because the SFIO, the Socialist Party, met that last week of December of 1920 and debated this question of whether to join the Third International. The vote came 3,200 for joining, 1,000 against joining, so that by more than 3-1, they voted to go into the Third International, and a schism was effected. The smaller part remained as the Socialist Party, the larger part became the Communist Party of France. And the same thing happened in Italy. In Italy, a Congress was held in January of 1921 at Livorno. And at the Congress of Livorno in January of 1921, the majority voted not to go into the Third International. The majority was then led by a figure whom we will have to deal with at greater length in another context, was led by Serrati. And Serrati was a centrist and blocked with his right wing at that Congress of Livorno, refused to do what the Russians demanded, namely to throw out the right wing of Turati and those other reformists, said for various reasons he would not do that, and consequently the majority voted not to accept the 21 conditions. The result was that the minority withdrew. The minority under Bordiga, the abstentionist, who represented the left wing of the party, and those factory councilmen of Turin, led by Antonio Gramsci. Between Gramsci's faction and Bordiga's, they held a separate Congress and founded their own Italian Communist Party. Now you see, by 1921, it looks as though the tactic is working, because you do have really a large international communist movement already founded. You have mass parties in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Czechoslovakia, in Bulgaria, in Norway, and you have smaller parties planted almost everywhere in Europe. It looks as though that tactic is working. But you see, at the inner core of that tactic is a terrific weakness that Lenin could never really cope with. And that is that in bringing these centrists into these mass parties, he was not able, nor were the conditions, nor was any action really able to transform them into revolutionary communists. And that was peculiarly apparent, for example, in the French party. That center was led by Marcel Cachin and Octave Blozin. And they were parliamentary types. They had sent that famous telegram back from Moscow in July of 1920, urging the SFIO to accept the conditions Moscow had set, but that's because they thought the way for the future was with the communist revolution. There were Russian armies near Warsaw at that time, and they thought Russian arms would sweep across Europe. And furthermore, they fully thought that they would be able to manage and handle any kind of Bolshevism, any kind of Bolshevik left in their party. So the result is that you have a French Communist Party founded, which really is in the hands of very social democratic types until they are ousted from the party in 1923, and the authentic leftists come into power. But for such a tiny period of time, because by that time, already, the communist parties were being looked upon by Moscow as real instruments of their foreign policy, and the leftists were ousted by 1925 on the orders of Moscow because they were unpliable, and you begin to enter in that age of Torres, that age of the bureaucrat who really simply does Moscow's bidding. In other words, what Lenin could not anticipate in 1920, that it really, in a period of relative peace in the 20s, that it really was impossible to create real communists out of the people admitted into the Communist International, to create real revolutionaries out of them. All of that came to be an unfortunate reality from Lenin's point of view. But he had, you see, another safeguard. It wasn't only the 21 conditions. Lenin also raised the question at Moscow in 1920 at the Second World Congress that really must detain us for a few minutes, because he did raise this question of the colonial revolution. And the colonial revolution, likewise, from the point of view of strategy, was to be a checkpoint against opportunism, because that colonial revolution, in Lenin's view, was constantly going to disorient Western capitalism. And in disorienting Western capitalism would constantly create a revolutionary turmoil, would dislocate the economies of the Western countries, and consequently create the milieu, create the atmosphere out of which social democrats could be turned into communists in the very cauldron of action. And so Lenin set himself at Moscow in 1920 to write a resolution on colonial and national liberation movements, which he considered so important and so integral a part of the world's revolutionary struggle. But if Lenin is much more sensitive about this question than Rosa Luxemburg was, for example, for I have told you how Rosa, for example, simply didn't believe that any national war was possible or progressive in an imperialistic age. Lenin much more sensitive, even before the war, to the progressive potentiality, the revolutionary potential of these third world struggles. If Lenin was much more sensitive than Rosa, and much more sensitive than his comrades in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, even he suffered from a certain misoptic, from a certain kind of false optic, through which he saw that colonial revolution in what we call Europeanocentric terms. And herein lies a very major strategic problem. Consider these particular aperçus or insights. The insight of Bukhari in 1919 at the 8th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. Every nationalist movement in the colonized world is for us, it is water for our mill, since it contributes to the destruction of Western imperialism. You see what Bukhari is saying. The real revolution is in the West. What the Eastern Revolution does, what it does in the Third World, is to disaggregate the economies of the West. It is accessory to our revolution. Or consider the call that goes out to that great Baku meeting in September of 1920, that first Congress of the Toiling Peoples of the East. And listen to how that call reads. Why is the Communist International convening a Congress of Persian, Armenian, and Turkish peasants and workers? What can it give them? Workers and peasants, the militant workers and peasants of Europe and America turn to you because the amalgamation of the Persian, Turkish, and Armenian peasants and workers with the great army of European workers will hasten the death of capital, and so bring about the liberation of workers and peasants the world over. What the call says is, we need your help to upset our ruling class. In other words, the optic is thoroughly European. There is, you see, a tremendous Marxist training that ultimately revolutions have to come in developed areas. And if Lenin himself is terribly sensitive to the symbiotic relationship between this third world revolution and what happens in the West, in Europe, still he reads it through that European optic. And that is characteristically true in the great debate he has at that Second World Congress with M.M. Roy. Now, Roy is somebody to conjure with. Roy is an Indian communist, and he was a relatively young man by the time the Second World Congress was held. He was only 30 years old, and Lenin was already 50 and an extremely prestigious guy. But Roy had had a real experience in his Indian movement. He joined that movement when he was 14 years old, the nationalist movement. And then when the First World War began, Roy had gone on a multi-country trip in the Far East, taking him all the way to the United States in search of arms and money and weapons for a real armed uprising in India that should throw out the British imperialists. Ultimately, he was ejected from the United States and consequently fled in 1919 to Mexico, and there became one of the founders of the Mexican Communist Party. And there met the Russian agent Borodin, who brought him to Moscow, introduced him to Lenin in time for this Second World Congress. Now there is a clash between Lenin and Roy, which is terribly important, because Lenin writes the theses on the colonial revolution, and he makes 2 points, both of which Roy disagrees with. The first point is that ultimately the revolution has to be first or sparked in the West, in the more advanced societies, and that there will be an interaction, and those societies in revolution will help liberate these colonial countries. And Roy answers in the Commission on Colonial Struggles this way, and read these terms so similar to the terms of the Maoists in the contemporary period, for the Chinese have said much the same thing about the bankruptcy of Russian leadership in the World Revolution. World capitalism draws its principal resources and its revenues, above all from the colonies. By passing on to the workers part of their profit, they draw there, and by thus rallying the workers to their side, they kill the revolutionary aspirations of Western workers. Thus, it is indispensable to transfer our energies to the development and expansion of the Asiatic revolution, according to the thesis that world communism depends upon the victory of Asiatic communism. What Roy is doing is becoming Asiocentric. In other words, he is turning the terms and he is saying that you buy off the workers in the West with co-optation, with improved standards of living, and it is in the underdeveloped areas that the revolution will come. Now, Lenin was impressed with the force of Roy's argument, and consequently, when the final resolution was passed, Lenin had revised it so that it is confusing, so that it looks like a symbiotic relationship, one revolution helping the other. That's about as far as Lenin was able to go. But on the second point of conflict, he really didn't make a compromise. The second point of conflict had to do with Lenin's view, and the view of the International, that you could not have a socialist revolution at once in the underdeveloped areas. That there wasn't a proletariat, which was, after all, the classic instrument of a socialist revolution. There wasn't a big enough proletariat. Since you have a mass of peasants, and since the peasants want land, quite obviously, the natural leadership for these national struggles is the indigenous or national bourgeoisie. In other words, it is Lenin's thesis that there has to be a collaboration with the bourgeoisie that wants its independence, wants its own kind of development. Not that he is saying, not for a minute, not that he is saying that these countries have to go through a capitalist stage. What he is saying is that in that struggle led by the bourgeoisie, there will be the conditions of freedom, the conditions of independence, not granted by Western imperialists, within which conditions the peasantry and the workers can organize in order to make their movement strong enough to make their revolution. But you must go through this stage of independence led by the bourgeoisie. Lenin puts it this way in the first draft that he writes. With regard to the more backward states and nations, in the feudal or patriarchal and In regard to the more backward states and nations in which feudal and patriarchal peasant relations predominate, it is important to bear in mind first that all communist parties must assist the bourgeois democratic liberation movement in those countries, and that the duty of rendering the most active assistance rests primarily with the workers of the country. The need for a determined struggle against attempts to give a communist coloring to bourgeois democratic liberation trends in the backward countries. The Communist International should support bourgeois democratic national movements in colonial and backward countries only on the condition that in those countries the elements of future proletarian parties, which will be communist not only in their name, are brought together and trained to understand their special tasks, that is, those of the struggle against the bourgeois democratic movements within their own countries. To which Roy answered your dream. He said, in the first place, we don't have that kind of bourgeoisie in the underdeveloped world. We have a comprador bourgeoisie. In other words, one that is economically dependent upon the Western world, upon Western capitalism. Furthermore, with that small indigenous capitalist group or bourgeois group that wants independence, the Western societies can always buy them all, always grant them rights in Parliament, always really co-opt them. But even if that weren't true, Warren Roy, if you have such a revolution led by the bourgeoisie, what makes you think that that indigenous bourgeoisie will bow out once the independence has come? It will turn upon its allies, and it will snuff out its working class and its peasant allies unless they struggle against it from the very beginning. Now that shook Lenin deeply, and so did it shake him that he permitted Roy's thesis on the necessity immediately of a proletarian struggle in the Eastern world. And he was thinking so much of the Indian experience, where you did have a working class, that Lenin let Roy's theses be printed separately, giving him that kind of encouragement to present his point of view. But the important thing is that when that resolution is passed, it is a resolution that already has in it all of the seeds of the later distortions of the Communist International's position on the colonial struggle. All of the seeds, though Lenin did not know it and did not want it, the seeds were there. The seed, for example, of that tendency that says that ultimately the value of the liberation struggle in the underdeveloped world is to create a friend for the Soviet Union, is to create, if you please, a friendly anti-imperialist government so that the revolutionary movement of the Western world or of Europe is protected. Now we know that that became the Soviet position. We know, for example, that the Soviet Union gave far more help to Nasser than it gives, for example, to North Vietnam. We know that it is concerned to support that kind of regime, though Nasser may have put down his communists and put them in jail, because this is a neutralist, anti-imperialist government, and consequently, the Russians want a friend. But we say that that is contemporary. The roots of it, or the seeds of it, really go back very far. And the paradigm case is the case of Turkey, already in 1920 and 21, on the basis of the implications of a resolution of that kind. Because in Turkey, you see, a defeated country in the First World War, and one that was being decimated by the peacemakers in that horrible Treaty of Sèvres, taking away so much of Turkey, reducing her, prostrating her, Turkey had a nationalist revolution by 1920, in which Mustafa Kemal, who was an extremely enlightened or modernist kind of army officer, led a nationalist revolution to try to revive that terrible Treaty of Sèvres. Now, along with somebody like Mustafa Kemal, there were Turkish communists also, a separate kind of movement, a separate organization. Now, what did the Russians do? From 1920 on, they made very friendly gestures toward Mustafa Kemal, toward this nationalist movement, until, within the framework of NEP, the new economic policy in 1921, when they were looking for friends on the outside, they made one of the very first treaties they ever made with the outside, the 16th of March of 1921, with the Turkish government of Mustafa Kemal, a friendship government. Now, this wasn't supporting communism. This was supporting, after all, a nationalist regime that would be anti-French, anti-British, and protect, after all, the Straits, so that the Russians could have goods coming in and consequently feed themselves if those imports were to reach them. And so you have that kind of position. But you see, it becomes much more difficult if Mustafa Kemal does what he did in 1922, persecutes the Turkish communists, and puts them in jail and suppresses their particular party. Then what in hell does the Third International do? What do the Russians do? They continue to maintain their friendship with Mustafa Kemal. They sacrifice at that particular time the Turkish communists. Now Radek put it very clearly in October of 1922. The reasons for Soviet Russia's support of Turkey are quite clear to the whole world. These measures do not consist in humanitarian things. We say it quite frankly because we can permit ourselves the luxury of this frankness. Soviet Russia is actuated by egotistical motives. Soviet Russia has a great interest in that the Britain ships bound for Russia and ships convoying naphtha destined for sale in West European markets are not held up by the order of the English Admiralty in the Straits. And consequently, when Roy stood, after all, at the Fourth Congress of the Third International in December of 1922 and said, what are you going to do about your Turkish communists who are being persecuted and so forth, the Comintern at that point passed a resolution, really an open letter, to the communists of Turkey, which indicated great sympathy for them and said this: it is inaugurating this new policy, talking about the repression in Turkey, by dissolving your party, suppressing your organizations, making mass arrests, and so forth. The Communist Party of Turkey has always supported the bourgeois national government in the struggle of the working masses against imperialism. The Communist Party of Turkey even proved its readiness, faced by the common enemy, to make temporary sacrifices, etc., all right, you are great people, you Turkish communists. Now, the Fourth Congress of the Communist International protests emphatically against this barbarous act and considers its duty to declare solemnly that it is willing to support any government or political party which does not play the part of a gendarme of imperialism, which will continue the fight against imperialism and reaction and will bring about democratic reforms for the Turkish working masses. It doesn't say we break off relations. Nor does it say we insist that you release the communists. What it says in effect to Mustafa Kemal is we continue our friendship with you so long as you are on the anti-colonial side. Well, you see, all of that is inherent in a position in this resolution that looks at the Third World Revolution through European-centric eyes, and in which holding forth or holding on to that Russian island becomes an immensely important one. The full implications of that, of course, you know perfectly well in the contemporary moment and in terms of the documents of the Chinese accusations against the Russians. And a great friend of mine, who is a very good scholar at Northwestern University, teaches Soviet history, came back from 6 months in the Soviet Union, and I saw him in France on his way back to the United States. We talked a great deal about the Russian position vis-a-vis Vietnam, and of course it was Turovsky's point of view that beyond question that the Russians would pull out if they could possibly do so vis-a-vis the Chinese. That they so hunger for that relationship or that alliance with the United States that even that Hanoi regime, even that kingpin really of that entire struggle in Southeast Asia might very well be expendable. And what Turovsky told me did not surprise me because I had had a conversation somewhat earlier with a Soviet historian. The Soviet historian, an extremely interesting, very elegant guy. And I hadn't caught his name when I first went to see him. He had called me up with some introduction by a Frenchman I know, and I had gone to see him. I hadn't caught the name. I said, "What did you say your name was?" And he said, Mikoyan. I said, "Oh, well, that's a well-known name." And he said, "Oh, well, that's my father." So he was the son of Mikoyan, and he was some kind of historian, and was doing some sort of work in the archives, not terribly interesting. But a very elegant type. And we began to talk, and I talked again about Vietnam. And I said, so you want to Vietnam? It's very far from Vietnam, isn't it, in Russia? He said, oh, well, we do many things. We have signs in the factories and so forth. I said, I know, but you send more help to Nasser than you do to Ho. And he said, I tell you, it is pretty far. The Russians pay, and they want a better society. There's more consumer goods and so forth. And then he said, but you see, he said, in North Korea, that would be different. I said, why? You said, well, you said North Korea, you see that as a dagger into the heartland of Russia. I said, well, you talk like Metternich. I said, in the age of the fusee, the age of the missile, and so forth, you talk about distance, about territorial propinquity, but that is still the mentality based upon a long period of experience of what is desirable in terms of maintaining that Russian base or that Russian island. And the seeds of that sort of thing, internationalist though he was, and certainly never subject to that sort of thing, the seeds are already in that thesis and resolution on the colonial struggle in 1920. Or take the second kind of abuse, which is the fact that the Western parties ultimately really ignored that article or that condition of entry into the Third International, which insisted that they carry on that anti-imperialist struggle. So that when you get to the Fifth Congress, terribly interesting Congress, held in July of 1924, there are these Easterners who begin to get up and begin to debate whether or not the communist parties of the West really give a damn. Sen Katayama, the Japanese, for example, says you really do nothing. It's all of this pro forma, manneristic kind of resolution against imperialism. And then gets up a kind of a slender young militant from Southeast Asia named Vladimir Lenin. And he speaks at this Fifth Congress, and what he says is, you all know that the real power and poison of imperialism are centered in the colonies, rather than in the home countries. The colonies furnish them with raw materials for their factories and soldiers for their armies. The colonies are the foundation of the counter-revolution. But when you speak of revolution, you disdain the colonies and you think only of Western revolutionaries. And Goyen Aikok, of course, one of the many pseudonyms of Ho Chi Minh, who spoke here at the Fifth Congress in 1924 and said you really don't give a damn and you don't recognize that the center really is an Asiatic center for this revolution you're talking about. Or the final kind of problem or abuse, which is the setting of a strategic line based upon this principle of the national bourgeoisie that became absolutely rigidified. Became rigidified and, of course, a catastrophe in the Chinese Revolution, the idea that there could not be an indigenous, autonomous, worker, peasant uprising, that first you had to have this kind of coalition with the national bourgeoisie. And Roy again gets up at that Fifth Congress in 1924 and says, good heavens, hasn't the Indian story taught you anything? 1920 to 22, we had this fantastic mass movement. Gandhi called it off. He represented that national bourgeoisie you're talking about, called it off precisely at the time when the mass had it in its hand to move all the way. All of which says that there is in that safeguard of the colonial revolution a point in Lenin's mind, but yet a point that is weakened or undermined precisely by the seeds of this later distortion of what the Third World Revolution was about. And yet you can't get out of the optic of 1920. Let me not confuse you. The point of the matter is that in 1920, Lenin and Trotsky and those people were internationalists. They were not trying to impose the Russian Revolution. They thought of an international revolution in which the Russian leadership was really a temporary leadership. This is a period still of free talk and free debate inside the Russian Communist Party, inside the Third International, and they think this tactic will work. The real turning point, a great turning point in history, comes in 1921. Because in 1921, the circumstances change. And when the circumstances change, the whole relationship of the Communist International and the communist movements in various countries changes. What I'm saying is that by 1921, it becomes apparent that there will not be a European revolution, that socialism will have to exist in that one country. It is the year of the new economic policy. It is the year, in other words, when you must relax controls over the economy in Russia. It is the year when the party in Russia begins to become very tough over its dissidents. And I told you how at that 10th-party Congress of 1921 in March that the workers' opposition was put down and the rule against factionalism was passed. But it is also the year in which the German Revolution definitively fails, and consequently, the revolution in the West will be forestalled. And it is about that German Revolution failing in the West that we must talk, because that is important. And when we talk about that March action of 1921 and its failure, we're talking about something of monumental importance. The failure to make a bona fide social revolution, the failure to make, if you please, a communist revolution in Germany, guarantees that power would be in the hands of an SPD that never touched and never uprooted or extirpated the roots of the old order. In other words, to already prepare the way to National Socialism. You never attack the bureaucracy, you never attack the army, you never attack the great industrialists. And in the second place, that failure of the communist revolution in Germany meant that the Soviet Union would have to live in a non-communist world, and so its relationship to the communist parties of the world perforce would change. Those relationships would mean that the parties now were not dedicated to making revolutions in their own countries, but to being instruments of Soviet foreign policy and creating the most favorable climate of opinion for relations with the Soviet Union. Those consequences really come out of the disaster of 1921 with the follow-ups that could not even be foreseen in 1921, namely the triumph of fascism in Italy in October of 1922 and the complete collapse of the German revolutionary movement in 1923. Now, what is this March action about, and how did it fail? And it is so instructional for all of us. Because what you're talking about, you see, in the March action in 1921 is really a putschist action, an effort on the part of the leaders of the Comintern and of certain leaders of the German Communist Party to make a revolution before the conditions are right. And the reaction to that was, of course, a disaster. You start with the fall of Paul Levi. Paul Levi had been the chief, after all, of the German Communist Party, and in January of 1921, he resigns as the head of the KKD. Now, the fall of Levi is instructive. Now, you can talk about Levi's fall in a lot of ways. It's talked about, for example, on the basis of personality, that this was a man who was very arrogant, who wasn't close to the masses, who loved surrealism and Dadaism, who was an aesthete, who was Jewish, who was rich, who was a lawyer, all sorts of things that are used as objections to Levi. And there are many things wrong with him. But basically, the fall of Levi comes in 1921 because he was pessimist, because he didn't believe in a mass revolution in Germany at that particular time. And consequently, what he thought was important was carefully, very slowly, without any risk, with complete caution, to build a large party. You already had a fairly large party after the fusion with the USPD. The important thing was to continue that particular mode. And so Levi, for example, on the 8th of January of 1921, publishes an appeal which is extremely interesting. He goes into the party newspaper, the Red Flag, the Rote Fahne, and he publishes an appeal to the SPD, to the USPD, to the trade unions, to all the non-communist parties and unions, and he urges a kind of united front tactic. What he urges is that all of these groupings get together to try to improve the condition of the workers. Now, that tactic was really predicated on the idea of winning over the workers from these other organizations in which they were still ensconced, to show them that only the communists would fight for better wages, would fight for better living conditions, would fight for their own self-protection armies, and so forth, that the communists would do that, the others would not. And so you get a man who really is thinking in terms of the tactic of strength building or party building, and who really is bent on putschism, who has ousted, after all, the putschist from his own organization. But he errs on the Italian question. He goes to Italy in January of 1921 to the Congress of Livorno. And there, when Serrati refuses to throw out his right wing, the Comintern agent, and you begin to have these Comintern agents, you see, at every Congress. And often they are Hungarians. The Hungarians, after all, have had a revolution that failed. You've got all of these unemployed Hungarian revolutionaries. And very frequently, men like Rákosi and so forth show up at these particular Congresses. Joseph Pepper, Rákosi, both of them were down there in Italy giving the Comintern line and saying that Serrati was wrong, that there should have been a split. Levi went back to Germany and wrote against Comintern interference. He said Serrati was perfectly correct. He should not have split that Italian party. The result was Rákosi, the Hungarian, came immediately to Berlin, forced a meeting of the Central Committee of the KKD, and Levi was ousted as the head of that particular party. And his critics, who were of the left in the party, who were much more putschist, came to control. Now, there were two factions of them. About one faction, it's a little bit interesting to talk. because that faction was the way left-wing faction of the German Communist Party, and it was headed by Ruth Fischer. Ruth Fischer. A short, fat, kind of histrionic Ruth Fischer, the daughter of a professor in Vienna, thrown out of the Vienna Party or the Austrian Party for being really an ultra-leftist, played the same game in the German Party. You may know her by her brothers' names. She is the sister of Gerhard and Hans Eisler. And at that particular infamous moment when the Internal Security Committee of the United States was calling witnesses to oust all kinds of people from America, this Ruth Fischer went and testified against her brothers, Hans and Gerhard Eisler, and consequently had a very peculiar career as an ultra-communist. So Ruth Fischer, with her constant cohort, Maslow, Arkady Maslow, always Fischer and Maslow, as though they were joined at the base of the spine, and then Reuter, who later became the mayor of Berlin. They represent really a very putschist left wing who want street action no matter what, under any conditions. But then another faction, headed by Brandler and by Paul Fröhlich and by Thalheimer, people who really are impressed with Radek and with the Comintern position, who are really very faithful Comintern people, and who buy what is now a Comintern line in 1921, which is the line of the revolutionary offensive. Now this is extraordinarily interesting, because inside the Comintern was something called the Little Bureau. A little bureau of three men, namely Radek and Bukharin and Zinoviev, who really wanted, at the beginning of 1921, to launch a kind of insurrection in Europe so that Russia would not have to go through that deadly retreat of the new economic policy, so that there really would be that European revolution. Lenin was no such fool, and Lenin played no part in this, and hardly knew it was going on. For Lenin, after all, if you had to make a retreat, you made the retreat, and you made it up later on. But you get these men insisting now that there has to be this insurrection, and they send off to Germany their emissary, that unemployed Hungarian, the most important of them, Bela Kun, whom Paul Levy would always call Genghis Kun. So Bela Kun arrives in March of 1921 to say, you know, the time is right for a revolutionary offensive. And these new leaders of the German Communist Party said, you think so? And Bela Kun said, of course, we're just right for revolution here in March of 1921. And then they were preempted, because suddenly the government in Prussia began a tremendous repression, an occupation of Prussian Saxony, a trap, and the German communists fell in. Worth to talk about, because traps are the order of the day.